Miraculous exodus out of the bottomless pit. Irshad's escape with her 6 children from the Mujahideen camps is a pivotal and hard-won moment in the novel. Her journey out of the camps is not a single dramatic breakout, but rather the culmination of years of endurance, repeated failed attempts, and finally, a window of opportunity created by external events. Here's how Irshad ultimately manages to escape with her children. 1. NATO airstrikes create chaos and opportunity. After years of being trapped in the Mujahideen camps in Afghanistan, Irshad's chance comes when NATO and US/UK Air Forces begin bombing the camps as part of the war on terror. The airstrikes devastate the camps, setting tents on fire and causing mass panic. Many are killed or injured, and the survivors, including Irshad and her children, are forced to flee into the mountains to escape the bombardment. 2. Flight across the border. In the chaos, Irshad gathers her 6 children. By this point, she has lost one child and others to violence or separation and escapes the burning camps. Along with other survivors, she flees on foot and by animal transport, crossing the border from Afghanistan into the Swat Valley in Pakistan. The journey is perilous, with constant threats from both the environment and armed groups, but the confusion and breakdown of camp authority allow her to slip away. 3. Hiding her identity. Once in Pakistan, Irshad hides her identity to avoid being recognized as the wife of a known terrorist and to protect her children. She changes her name to Iman Atta and claims to be an American widow, not an Australian, and not connected to the Mujahideen. She also disguises herself and her children with Islamic dress to blend in with the refugee population. 4. Seeking refugee status. Irshad and her children join the Afghan refugee camps in Pakistan. She approaches the United Nations authorities, claiming to be a refugee widow from the war, and is granted temporary protection. She continues to conceal her true background, knowing that any association with terrorism would prevent her from receiving help or resettlement. 5. The long road to freedom. Irshad's escape is not the end of her ordeal. She faces further dangers, including the kidnapping of 2 of her sons by militants, sexual violence, and imprisonment by Indian authorities after a desperate crossing into India. However, the initial escape from the Mujahideen camps is made possible by the external chaos of war, her quick thinking, and her willingness to take enormous risks for her children. Summary table. Key steps in Irshad's escape. Step. Description. 1. Chaos from NATO airstrikes. Camps are bombed, creating confusion and breaking down control. 2. Fleeing with children. Irshad escapes with her 6 children, traveling on foot and by animal. 3. Crossing into Pakistan. She crosses the border into the Swat Valley, hiding among refugees. 4. Hiding identity. Changes name, claims to be an American widow, and blends in. 5. Seeking UN help. Joins refugee camps, applies for protection and resettlement. Key points. The escape is only possible because the external military intervention disrupts the camp's control. Irshad's resourcefulness, ability to hide her identity, and determination to keep her children together are crucial. Even after escaping the camps, her journey to safety and freedom is long and fraught with new dangers. Irshad faces a series of severe and complex challenges after escaping Afghanistan and entering Pakistan with her 6 children. Her ordeal in Pakistan is marked by danger, deprivation, and repeated threats to her safety and her family's future. Here are the main challenges she encounters. 1. Hiding her identity. Reason. Irshad is the widow of a known terrorist and a foreigner. Being identified could mean arrest, deportation, or worse. How? She changes her name to Iman Atta, claims to be an American widow, and disguises herself and her children in Islamic dress to blend in with the refugee population. 2. Life in refugee camps. Conditions. The camps are overcrowded, unsanitary, and dangerous. Food and medical care are scarce, and disease is rampant. Impact. Irshad and her children suffer from illness, hunger, and the constant threat of violence or exploitation. 3. Threat of kidnapping and recruitment. What happens? Two of Irshad's sons are kidnapped by militants, Lashkar-e-Taiba, at the Pakistan-India border, with the intention of recruiting them as child soldiers for jihad. Consequence: this is a devastating loss for Irshad, who is powerless to stop the abduction and is left traumatized and desperate. 4. Sexual violence and exploitation. Incident: after crossing into India, Irshad is arrested and detained by Indian soldiers, who beat and gang-rape her in a military camp in Kashmir. Result: she becomes pregnant as a result of the assault, adding to her trauma and complicating her legal and emotional situation. 5. Legal and bureaucratic obstacles. Refugee status. Irshad applies for refugee status with the UN in Pakistan, but her case is complicated by her hidden identity and lack of documentation. Crossing borders, she is forced to cross illegally into India, where she is arrested and accused of being a Pakistani spy, leading to further imprisonment and hardship. 6. Imprisonment and separation. In India, Irshad and her children are imprisoned for illegal entry and suspected espionage. They face the threat of long-term detention and separation. Release. Only after a human rights activist intervenes is her case brought to the attention of the UN, leading to her eventual release and recognition as a refugee. 7. Ongoing fear and instability. Constant threat. Even after being recognized as a refugee, Irshad lives in fear of being discovered, deported, or targeted by militants or authorities. Uncertainty. She has no stable home, no secure future for her children, and must constantly adapt to survive. Summary table. Challenges in Pakistan. Challenge. Description: hiding identity. Changes name, claims to be American, disguises herself and children. Refugee camp conditions. Overcrowding, disease, hunger, lack of safety. Kidnapping/recruitment. Two sons abducted by militants for jihad. Sexual violence. Beaten and raped by Indian soldiers after crossing border. Legal/bureaucratic issues. Difficulty obtaining refugee status, arrested as a suspected spy. Imprisonment/separation. Detained with children, threatened with long-term separation. Ongoing fear/instability. No security, constant threat of discovery or violence. In essence, Irshad's time in Pakistan is marked by relentless adversity. She must hide who she is, survive in brutal conditions, endure the loss of her sons, suffer sexual violence, and navigate a hostile legal system, all while trying to keep her remaining children safe and find a path to freedom. The NATO airstrikes on the Mujahideen camps and their families in "For the Sake of My Children" have devastating, far-reaching effects, both immediate and long-term. Here's a detailed description based on the novel. Immediate effects. 1. Destruction and chaos. The airstrikes devastate the camps, setting tents and shelters on fire. The bombardment is described as so intense that every hut and tent in the camps caught fire, and the survivors are forced to flee into the mountains to escape the bombs. Many people are killed or maimed instantly. Everyone she knows in those camps has either been blown to pieces by those huge bombs, lost a leg or hand, or gone deaf and dumb. 2. Panic and mass flight. The airstrikes create mass panic. Families are separated as people run for their lives. The survivors, including Irshad and her children, are forced to flee into the mountains to hide from the soon-to-come NATO forces. The camps are described as being like death camps, and the survivors feel as if they are fleeing with the Prophet Lot and his family from the fires of Sodom and Gomorrah, or fleeing from God's punishment on the day of resurrection. 3. Loss of shelter and resources. All basic infrastructure is destroyed. Every hut and tent in the camps caught fire. There is no food, water, or medical care left for the survivors. The environment becomes even more hostile and dangerous. Long-term effects. 1. Displacement and refugee crisis. The survivors, including women and children, are forced to become refugees once again, crossing borders into Pakistan or hiding in the mountains. The remaining Mujahideen families were scattered everywhere. They are without any protection or any means of transportation. Many are left with no shelter, and those who try to escape by vehicle are targeted. The foreign planes identified and destroyed every vehicle carrying the Mujahideen and their families. Therefore, the only way to escape is to use animals like donkeys and horses to travel from one place to another or to walk on foot. 2. Family separation and trauma. Families are separated in the chaos. Children are lost, kidnapped, or killed. The trauma of witnessing death, injury, and the destruction of their homes leaves deep psychological scars. 3. Increased vulnerability. The survivors, especially women and children, become even more vulnerable to violence, exploitation, and trafficking as they flee without protection or resources. 4. Breakdown of social structure. The destruction of the camps means the collapse of whatever social order or support system existed. People are left to fend for themselves, and the sense of community is shattered. Symbolic and emotional impact. The airstrikes are described as a divine exodus or judgment, likened to biblical catastrophes. Survivors feel both terror and a strange sense of liberation, as the destruction of the camps finally creates an opportunity for escape, but at a terrible cost. Summary table. Effects of NATO airstrikes. Effect. Description. Destruction and chaos. Camps destroyed. Fires, mass casualties, panic. Mass flight. Families flee into mountains, many separated or lost. Loss of shelter/resources. No food, water, or medical care, infrastructure gone. Displacement. Survivors become refugees, forced to cross borders on foot or by animal. Family separation and trauma. Children lost/killed, deep psychological scars. Increased vulnerability. Women/children at risk of violence, exploitation. Breakdown of social order. Collapse of community, everyone fends for themselves. Symbolic/emotional impact. Seen as divine judgment, both terror and opportunity for escape. In summary, the NATO airstrikes obliterate the Mujahideen camps, causing mass death, panic, and the total collapse of the camp society. Survivors are left traumatized, displaced, and vulnerable, but for some, like Irshad, the chaos also creates the first real chance to escape with their children. How did she hide her identity in Pakistan? Irshad's ability to hide her identity in Pakistan was a matter of survival, and she used several strategies to avoid detection and protect herself and her children. Here's how she managed it, based on the novel. 1. Changing her name and backstory. Adopted a new name. Irshad changed her name to Iman Atta while in the refugee camps in Pakistan. This new identity helped her blend in and avoid being recognized as the wife of a known terrorist or as someone associated with the Mujahideen. Claimed a different nationality. She told the UN authorities and others in the refugee camps that she was born and brought up in the USA, not Australia. She claimed her husband died during air raids in Afghanistan, and she hid her Australian background to avoid being sent back or being linked to her past. 2. Concealing her appearance. Wore Islamic dress. Irshad wore the Islamic veil, burqa/niqab, to hide her Western features and blonde hair. This made it difficult for anyone to identify her as a foreigner or as someone with a Western background. Blended in with local women. By adopting the dress and customs of the local Afghan and Pakistani women, she avoided drawing attention to herself or her children. 3. Avoiding official channels. Did not approach the Australian embassy. After her previous attempt to get help from the Australian embassy failed because of her association with terrorists, she avoided all official Western channels and did not try to obtain passports or visas through them. Used refugee networks. She relied on the refugee system and the UN for basic support, but kept her story consistent and avoided giving details that could reveal her true identity. 4. Lying about her past. Concealed her association with the Mujahideen. She did not reveal her past life in Afghanistan, her late husband's terrorist activities, or her own suffering in the Mujahideen camps. She presented herself as just another widow fleeing war. Changed her children's names. She also changed her children's names to fit her new identity and story. 5. Avoiding suspicion. Kept a low profile. Irshad avoided drawing attention to herself or her children, did not discuss her background, and avoided contact with anyone who might recognize her or ask probing questions. Did not reveal her Western origins. She was careful not to speak English in public or display any Western habits that might make her stand out. Summary table. Method. Description. Changed name and nationality. Became Iman Atta, claimed to be American, not Australian. Wore Islamic dress. Used burqa/niqab to hide her Western features. Avoided embassies. Did not approach Australian embassy after previous rejection. Concealed past. Did not reveal association with Mujahideen or her late husband's terrorist activities. Changed children's names. Gave children new names to match her new identity. Kept low profile. Avoided attention. Did not speak English or act in a Western manner. In summary, Irshad survived in Pakistan by completely reinventing herself and her children, hiding behind a new name, story, and appearance, and avoiding any action that could reveal her true identity or past. This allowed her to remain safe in the refugee camps and eventually seek a way out for herself and her children. Irshad's protection of her children during their ordeal in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and beyond is a central theme of "For the Sake of My Children." Her strategies and sacrifices are both practical and deeply emotional. Here's how she protected her children, based strictly on the novel. 1. Refusing to leave without them. Irshad's entire motivation for survival is her children. She repeatedly refuses opportunities to escape or return to Australia if it means leaving her children behind, even when her own life is at risk. She endures abuse, imprisonment, and deprivation rather than abandon them. 2. Enduring abuse and hardship. She absorbs violence and humiliation to shield her children. Irshad stays in abusive marriages, submits to humiliating religious and legal requirements, and even agrees to a forced marriage with a muhalal, a man she must marry and sleep with to be allowed to remarry her ex-husband, because she knows that if she leaves or resists, she will lose her children forever. 3. Attempting escape, always with her children. She orchestrates escape attempts that always include her children. For example, in Saudi Arabia, she tries to flee with her children to the Australian embassy, risking arrest and severe punishment. Even when told by authorities that she could leave alone, she refuses, knowing her children would be left in an abusive environment. 4. Hiding their identities. She changes their names and backstories. In Pakistan, Irshad gives her children new names and claims they are American, not Australian, to avoid being sent back to Afghanistan or being associated with terrorism. She dresses them in local clothing and teaches them to avoid drawing attention. 5. Providing for their basic needs. She fights for food, shelter, and medical care. In refugee camps and during their escape, Irshad does whatever is necessary to keep her children fed and safe, even when resources are scarce and conditions are harsh. 6. Emotional protection and reassurance. She offers comfort and hope. Even in the darkest moments, during bombings, imprisonment, or separation, Irshad reassures her children, tries to keep their spirits up, and promises she will never abandon them. Her love and presence are their main source of psychological survival. 7. Fighting for custody and legal rights. She battles in court and with authorities. When separated from her children by Sharia law or local authorities, Irshad fights for custody, presents evidence of abuse, and never gives up her legal battle, even when the system is stacked against her. 8. Sacrificing her own freedom. She stays in dangerous places to avoid losing them. After her husband's death, Irshad is told she can leave Afghanistan, but not with her children. She chooses to remain in the camps, enduring further abuse and deprivation, rather than leave them behind. 9. Seeking help from allies. She builds alliances with other women and aid workers. Irshad befriends other women in similar situations, such as Sulwa in Saudi Arabia and Nadia in Pakistan, who help her with practical support, information, and emotional solidarity. 10. Never giving up. Her relentless determination is her greatest protection. No matter how many times she is beaten, betrayed, or separated from her children, Irshad never stops fighting to protect, reunite with, and eventually rescue them. Summary table: How Irshad protected her children. Method. Example from the novel. Refused to leave without them. Stayed in abusive marriages, refused solo escape offers. Endured abuse for their sake. Submitted to forced marriage, humiliation, violence. Orchestrated escapes. Planned and attempted escapes, always including her children. Hid their identities. Changed names, claimed different nationality, dressed them to blend in. Provided basic needs. Fought for food, shelter, and medical care in camps and during flight. Offered emotional support. Reassured, comforted, and gave hope during trauma. Fought for custody. Battled in Sharia courts, presented evidence, never gave up legal fight. Sacrificed her freedom. Stayed in camps and dangerous places to avoid separation. Built alliances. Befriended and relied on other women and aid workers. Never gave up. Persisted through every setback and trauma. In summary, Irshad's protection of her children is a combination of physical, emotional, legal, and psychological strategies, all rooted in her unwavering maternal love and determination. She endures unimaginable suffering, makes enormous sacrifices, and never gives up hope, always putting her children's safety and future above her own. Irshad chose the name Iman Atta as part of her strategy to hide her identity and protect herself and her children while living as a refugee in Pakistan. Here's how and why she made this choice, based on the novel. 1. To conceal her Western and Australian identity. Iman is a common Muslim female name, meaning faith in Arabic. By adopting this name, Irshad could blend in with the local Muslim population and avoid standing out as a foreigner or Westerner. Atta is also a common surname in the Muslim world, especially in South Asia and the Middle East. It does not raise suspicion and helps her pass as a local or as someone from a Muslim-majority country. 2. To avoid association with her past and her husband. Irshad's real name and background, as Susan Peterson, an Australian, and the wife of a known terrorist, would have put her and her children at risk of being deported, arrested, or targeted by authorities or extremists. By choosing a new name, she could create a new backstory, claiming to be an American Muslim widow whose husband died in Afghanistan, rather than an Australian with a controversial past. 3. To facilitate refugee processing and aid. Presenting herself as Iman Atta and her children as American Muslims made it easier to receive aid and protection from the UN and other refugee agencies, who might be more sympathetic to her case if she appeared to be a typical war widow rather than someone with a complicated or suspicious background. 4. To protect her children. Changing her name and her children's names was a way to shield them from being tracked, kidnapped, or forcibly returned to Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia, where they would be at risk due to their father's notoriety and their mother's apostasy. 5. To blend in culturally and religiously. The name Iman Atta allowed her to blend in with the predominantly Muslim refugee population in Pakistan and avoid drawing attention from both authorities and local communities who might be suspicious of foreigners or Westerners. In summary, Irshad chose the name Iman Atta because it was a common, unremarkable Muslim name that would not attract suspicion, allowed her to invent a new, safer identity, and helped her and her children survive as refugees in a hostile and dangerous environment. Irshad chose the name Iman Atta, the same name as her late husband's child bride who died in Saudi Arabia while giving birth to her first baby, as an act of honor, remembrance, and survival. Here's how the novel explains her reasoning. 1. Honoring the innocent victim. The child bride, Iman Atta, was a minor girl, just 14 or 15, whom Irshad's husband, Mustafa, married as a second wife in Saudi Arabia. This girl died tragically during childbirth because Mustafa refused to take her to the hospital, fearing a male doctor would see her body. Irshad felt deep pity and sorrow for this girl, recognizing her as another victim of the same patriarchal and abusive system that had entrapped Irshad herself. By adopting the name Iman Atta, Irshad was memorializing the innocent girl who lost her life due to the cruelty and neglect of the system and of Mustafa. It was a way to keep her memory alive and to acknowledge the suffering of all girls and women subjected to such abuse. 2. Creating a plausible local identity. Iman Atta is a common Muslim name, and using it helped Irshad blend in among refugees in Pakistan and later India. It was a name that would not raise suspicion and would allow her to pass as a local or as someone from a Muslim-majority country, rather than as a Westerner or someone with a controversial past. By choosing the name of someone who had died, Irshad also ensured that there would be no living person with that identity who could contradict her story or expose her. 3. Personal meaning and emotional connection. The choice was not random. Irshad's experience with the child bride Iman Atta was a turning point in her own understanding of the dangers and injustices faced by women and girls in the societies she lived in. Taking this name was a way of carrying that lesson and that memory with her as she tried to build a new life for herself and her children. 4. Survival strategy. In practical terms, the name Iman Atta allowed Irshad to hide her true identity from authorities, extremists, and anyone who might be searching for her as the wife of a known terrorist or as an apostate. It was a shield that protected her and her children during their dangerous journey as refugees. In summary, Irshad chose the name Iman Atta both to honor the memory of her late husband's child bride, an innocent victim of the same system that oppressed Irshad, and to create a safe, plausible identity for herself and her children as they fled danger. The name was a tribute, a disguise, and a symbol of solidarity with all abused girls and women. How did she feel about using that name? Irshad's feelings about using the name are complex. Bittersweet and painful, she feels sympathy and sorrow for the young girl who died, and using her name is a constant reminder of the suffering inflicted on women and girls in the societies she escaped. A tribute, it is also a way for Irshad to keep the memory of the child bride alive, acknowledging her as a fellow victim. A means of survival. Despite the emotional weight, Irshad knows that adopting the name is necessary for her own safety and the protection of her children. It is a sacrifice she makes for their sake, even if it brings up painful memories. Irshad lost her two sons, Abu Bakr and Omar, in Pakistan under tragic and violent circumstances after escaping Afghanistan and crossing into Pakistan with her children. Here's how it happened, based on the novel's content. 1. The journey and the danger. After the NATO airstrikes on the Mujahideen camps, Irshad fled with her 6 children into Pakistan. The journey was perilous, involving travel through dangerous, militant-controlled areas near the Pakistan-India border. This region was rife with terrorist groups such as Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Muhammad, who were known for recruiting boys for jihad and carrying out attacks in India. 2. The kidnapping. While attempting to cross from Pakistan into India, through the disputed and highly militarized region of Jammu and Kashmir, Irshad and her children were targeted by militants. Her 2 eldest sons, Abu Bakr and Omar, were kidnapped by Pakistani terrorists. The intention was to recruit them as child soldiers for jihadist operations. Despite Irshad's desperate pleas and attempts to save them, the militants forcibly took the boys from her. 3. The aftermath and their fate. Abu Bakr. According to information Irshad later receives from a reliable source, Abu Bakr was recruited by Lashkar-e-Taiba and participated in the terrorist attack on the Taj Mahal Palace Hotel in Mumbai, Bombay, India. He was killed by Indian commandos during the operation. Omar was killed in an American drone airstrike on the Mujahideen in the Swat Valley, Pakistan, where he had been taken and used as a child fighter. 4. Emotional impact on Irshad. The loss of her 2 sons was devastating for Irshad. She blamed herself for their fate, feeling that her decisions and the circumstances of their escape led to their deaths. The trauma of losing her sons to terrorist recruitment and violence haunted her, and she considered it one of the most painful consequences of her years of suffering and displacement. Summary table. Son. Fate. Abu Bakr. Kidnapped by militants, recruited by Lashkar-e-Taiba, killed in Mumbai terror attack. Omar. Kidnapped by militants, killed in a U.S. drone strike in the Swat Valley. When Irshad, using the name Iman Atta, and her children crossed the border from Pakistan into India, they were captured by the Indian Army. Here's what happened to her, based strictly on the novel's content. 1. Arrest and accusation. Irshad and her children were picked up by Indian military patrols as they crossed the border illegally, without official documents. The Indian soldiers, suspicious of her background and Muslim identity, accused her of being a Pakistani Muslim spy and detained her and her children in a military facility in Kashmir. 2. Abuse and imprisonment. Irshad was brutally beaten and gang-raped by several Indian soldiers while in military detention. She and her children were then imprisoned for a month in a military detention facility before being transferred to a women's prison in New Delhi. 3. Legal limbo and human rights intervention. Irshad was charged with illegal entry and espionage for Pakistan. Normally, such charges would mean years of pretrial detention, but her case came to the attention of a human rights activist who visited the New Delhi women's prison and published her story in the Times of India. This exposure led the United Nations Refugee Office in New Delhi to intervene, appoint a lawyer for her, and expedite her trial. 4. Acquittal and refugee status. Within 2 months, Irshad was tried and acquitted due to lack of evidence. The UN office recognized her as a refugee and granted her and her children political asylum in India, providing them with housing and financial support. 5. Aftermath. Irshad's ordeal in Indian custody left her physically and emotionally scarred. She discovered she was pregnant as a result of the rape by Indian soldiers and later gave birth to twins. Despite the trauma, she was able to rebuild her life temporarily in India with the help of the UN and eventually sought resettlement in the West. Summary table. Event. Details. Arrest. Captured by Indian Army at the border, accused of being a Pakistani spy. Abuse. Beaten and gang-raped by soldiers, imprisoned with her children. Legal limbo. Charged with espionage, faced long detention. Human rights intervention. Case publicized, UN intervened, lawyer appointed. Acquittal and refugee status. Acquitted, granted asylum in India, received support from UN. Aftermath. Left with trauma, gave birth to twins, began process for resettlement. Irshad and her children's time in the Indian jail in New Delhi is depicted as a period of severe hardship, humiliation, and uncertainty. Here's a detailed summary of their experience and how she ultimately manages to be set free. Hardships in the Indian jail. 1. Overcrowding and filth. The women's prison in New Delhi is described as filthy, overcrowded, and inhumane, more like a death camp than a correctional facility. There are no proper cells or dormitories. Women are packed together, exposed to the elements, and must fight for food and basic survival. Disease, violence, and abuse are rampant, and many inmates die before serving out their sentences. 2. Physical and psychological suffering. Irshad and her children endure hunger, illness, and exposure to violence from both guards and other inmates. The psychological toll is immense. Irshad is haunted by memories of abuse, fears for her children's future, and is traumatized by her recent experiences. She is forced to suppress her pain and focus on survival, often standing or sitting in uncomfortable positions to avoid contact with the most violent or diseased prisoners. 3. Social isolation and vulnerability. As a foreign woman and a mother with children, Irshad is especially vulnerable. She must protect her children from abuse, illness, and the dangers of the prison environment. She is isolated from any support network and must rely on her own resilience and resourcefulness. 4. Violence and abuse. The prison is rife with violence. Irshad must avoid unnecessary conflict with other inmates and guards, understanding that drawing attention could make her a target for further abuse. She witnesses and experiences the brutality of the system, which leaves her physically and emotionally scarred. How Irshad manages to be set free. 1. Legal process and advocacy. After being detained, Irshad's case eventually goes to trial. She is accused of illegally entering India and of being a Pakistani spy. With the help of a lawyer, appointed after her plight is publicized, she is able to present her case in court. DNA evidence from her twin sons, conceived during her rape by Indian soldiers, is used to identify the perpetrators, which helps prove her innocence regarding the espionage charges and exposes the abuse she suffered. 2. Media and human rights intervention. Her case is picked up by a human rights activist who visits the prison and interviews her. The interview is published in the Times of India, drawing public attention to her plight. The United Nations Refugee Office in New Delhi becomes involved, appoints a lawyer and advocates for her release. The media coverage and UN intervention put pressure on the authorities to expedite her trial and ensure a fair hearing. 3. Acquittal and refugee status. Within 2 months, Irshad is tried and acquitted due to lack of evidence. The UN office recognizes her as a refugee and grants her the right to political asylum in India. She is provided with financial assistance, housing, and support for her and her children, allowing her to begin rebuilding her life after release. Summary table. Hardship in jail. How she overcomes it. Overcrowding, filth, disease. Endurance, adaptation, mental resilience. Violence, abuse, hunger. Avoids conflict, focuses on survival, protects kids. Social isolation, trauma. Clings to hope, draws strength from love for children. Legal accusations, uncertainty. UN/legal aid, DNA evidence, media attention. Risk of indefinite detention. Human rights advocacy, public pressure, fair trial. In essence, Irshad's survival in the Indian jail is a testament to her resilience, adaptability, and determination to endure for the sake of her children. She is ultimately set free through a combination of legal advocacy, media exposure, and the intervention of international human rights organizations, which together force the authorities to recognize her innocence and grant her asylum. After Irshad, using the name Aman Atta, and her children are released from the Indian jail in New Delhi, their life is marked by a mix of relief, ongoing hardship, and gradual rebuilding. 1. Immediate aftermath. Relief and support. Refugee status and UN support. Upon her acquittal and release, Irshad is recognized as a refugee by the United Nations office in New Delhi. She is granted political asylum in India, which provides her with a degree of safety and legal protection. Financial assistance and housing. The UN office helps her rent an apartment and promises to pay her monthly rent and provide regular financial assistance for her and her children. This support is crucial, as she has no other means of income or support in India. 2. Ongoing hardships. Trauma and recovery. Irshad and her children are deeply traumatized by their experiences, first in the Mujahideen camps, then during their harrowing escape, and finally by the abuse and deprivation in jail. The psychological scars are significant, and recovery is slow. Social isolation. As a foreign refugee, Irshad is isolated from her home culture and has to navigate a new society with limited resources and support networks. She must also continue to hide her true identity and past to protect herself and her children from potential threats. Legal and bureaucratic obstacles. Although she is granted asylum, her future remains uncertain. She faces bureaucratic hurdles in seeking permanent resettlement in a Western country, and her attempts to secure a better life for her children are met with delays and setbacks. 3. Steps toward rebuilding. Seeking resettlement. Irshad's main goal after release is to secure resettlement in a Western country, where she believes her children will have a chance at safety, education, and a normal life. She applies for resettlement through the UN, and her case is eventually referred to the Canadian and Australian embassies. Identity change. She continues to use the name Aman Atta and maintains the story that she is an American Muslim widow, not revealing her true background. This is both a survival strategy and a way to distance herself from her traumatic past. Caring for her children, Irshad focuses on her children's well-being, trying to provide them with stability, education, and emotional support. She is determined to protect them from further harm and to give them hope for a better future. 4. Legal victory and justice. Suing the Indian Army, with the help of her lawyer and DNA evidence, Irshad successfully sues the Indian soldiers who raped her. The perpetrators are identified, tried, and sentenced to prison, which brings a measure of justice and closure to that chapter of her ordeal. 5. Gradual improvement. Recognition and asylum. The recognition of her refugee status and the support from the UN mark a turning point. While life is still difficult, Irshad and her children are no longer in immediate danger, and they have access to basic needs and some hope for the future. Hope for resettlement. Eventually, her case is accepted for resettlement in Canada, which opens the door to a new life and the possibility of healing and rebuilding after years of trauma. In summary, life after release from the Indian jail is a slow, painful process of recovery and adaptation. Irshad and her children face ongoing trauma, social isolation, and uncertainty, but with the help of the UN and eventual resettlement, they begin to rebuild their lives and look toward a safer, more hopeful future. Irshad and her children's adaptation to life in India after their release from jail was a gradual, challenging process marked by both relief and ongoing struggle. Here's how they adapted, based on the novel's account. 1. Initial adjustment, relief and shelter. UN refugee status. After her acquittal, Irshad, as Aman Atta, was recognized as a refugee by the United Nations office in New Delhi. This status provided her with legal protection and access to basic support. Housing and financial aid. The UN office helped her rent an apartment and provided regular financial assistance for her and her children. This was a crucial foundation for their adaptation, as they had no other resources or family in India. 2. Coping with trauma and loss. Psychological recovery. The family was deeply traumatized by their experiences in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the Indian jail. Irshad and her children struggled with nightmares, anxiety, and the psychological scars of violence, abuse, and separation. Recovery was slow, and Irshad focused on providing emotional support and stability for her children. Social isolation. As foreigners and refugees, they were isolated from Indian society and had to be cautious about revealing their true identities. Irshad continued to use her assumed name and backstory to avoid attracting attention or endangering her family. 3. Navigating daily life. Learning to survive. Irshad had to learn how to navigate Indian bureaucracy, access healthcare, and manage daily life in a new and unfamiliar environment. She relied on the support of the UN and local NGOs for guidance. Education and routine. She prioritized her children's education and well-being, seeking opportunities for them to attend school or receive basic instruction, even if informally. Establishing routines helped the family regain a sense of normalcy. 4. Hiding their identity. Maintaining the cover story, Irshad continued to present herself as Aman Atta, an American Muslim widow, and did not reveal her Australian origin or her connection to her late husband's notoriety. She also changed her children's names and backgrounds in official records to protect them. 5. Seeking a future. Applying for resettlement, Irshad's main goal was to secure resettlement in a Western country where her children could have a safe and hopeful future. She worked with the UN office to apply for resettlement, eventually leading to their acceptance for immigration to Canada. Legal action and justice. With the help of her lawyer and DNA evidence, Irshad successfully sued the Indian soldiers who had raped her, resulting in their conviction. This legal victory brought some measure of justice and closure. 6. Gradual healing and hope. Building a new life. Over time, with the support of the UN and the prospect of resettlement, Irshad and her children began to heal and adapt. They learned to navigate their new environment, built new routines, and looked forward to a future beyond the trauma they had endured. In summary, Adapting to life in India was a slow, difficult process for Irshad and her children, marked by relief at their freedom, ongoing trauma, social isolation, and the constant hope for a better future. Their resilience, the support of international organizations, and Irshad's determination to protect and provide for her children were key to their survival and eventual adaptation. When the American embassy in India discovers that Iman Atta, Irshad, lied about her country of origin, their reaction is one of skepticism, investigation, and ultimately rejection of her claim for resettlement. 1. Discovery of the lie. Background: Irshad, using the name Iman Atta, claims to be an American Muslim widow to increase her chances of being resettled in the West. She provides a fabricated backstory, including a supposed American address and family details. Embassy investigation. When her case is referred to the American Embassy by the UN Office for Possible Resettlement, the embassy staff begin to verify her claim. They check the address, family names, and other details she provided. 2. Embassy's reaction. Verification failure. The embassy discovers that the address she gave belongs to an American family with no children, and that there is no record of her or her supposed family in the United States. The names she provides do not match any official records. Rejection. As a result, the American embassy rejects her application for resettlement, informing her that she cannot substantiate her claim to be an American citizen. They do not pursue criminal charges for the false claim, but they do not offer her asylum or resettlement. Notification to UN. The embassy notifies the UN office that Iman Atta is not an American citizen and that her claim was fabricated. However, the UN office does not revoke her refugee status or stop her support, recognizing that such fabrications are common among refugees seeking safety. 3. Consequences for Irshad. No U.S. resettlement. Irshad's hope of being resettled in the United States is dashed. She is not prosecuted, but her case is closed by the embassy. Continued refugee status. Despite the exposure of her lie, she remains a recognized refugee in India and continues to receive support from the UN. She later applies for resettlement in other countries, eventually being accepted by Canada. In summary, the American embassy responds to Irshad's deception with a thorough investigation, rejection of her resettlement claim, and notification to the UN, but does not pursue legal action. Irshad remains in India as a refugee and eventually finds a path to safety elsewhere. Iman Atta's, Irshad's, reflection on the question, who are the true Muslims, moderates or terrorists, is a central theme in For the Sake of My Children. Her answer is nuanced, deeply personal, and shaped by her harrowing experiences in both moderate and extremist Muslim societies. Summary of Iman Atta's reflection. 2 Faces of Islam. Iman observes that Islam, as she experienced it, contains 2 contradictory messages. The first is the peaceful, tolerant Islam preached by Muhammad in Mecca, which allows freedom of belief and is often cited by Muslims in the West to present Islam as a religion of peace. The second is the violent, intolerant Islam of Medina, where Muhammad called for jihad, enforced misogynistic laws, and demanded absolute obedience, including violence against non-believers and apostates. Moderates versus terrorists. She notes that both moderates and terrorists claim legitimacy from the Quran and Hadith. Moderates follow the Meccan message, emphasizing peace and coexistence, while terrorists follow the Medinan message, justifying violence, jihad, and the subjugation of women. Both groups can cite authentic religious texts to support their views. Her personal crisis. Living among both groups, Iman is initially unable to answer who the real Muslims are. She sees that moderates and terrorists both have legitimate and tangible evidence from the main Islamic texts. Her own suffering, especially under those who strictly follow the Medinan message, leads her to question the very foundations of the faith as it is practiced in many societies. Conclusion. Iman's reflection is that the division is not clear-cut. The true Muslim can be either, depending on which part of the tradition they choose to follow. She ultimately concludes that the violent, oppressive practices she endured are not aberrations, but are rooted in the same texts that moderates use to justify peace. This realization is a turning point in her spiritual journey and leads to her eventual rejection of Islam in favor of a faith and worldview that, for her, better aligns with justice and compassion. In her words, the million-dollar question, who are the real Muslims, moderates or terrorists, remains unanswered for her for a long time because both have scriptural support. Her lived experience, however, leads her to see the dangers of the extremist interpretation as not merely a distortion, but as a legitimate, if tragic, reading of the tradition. In her reflection on the question of who are the true Muslims, moderates or terrorists, Iman Atta, Irshad, references a range of Islamic texts, both from the Quran and the Hadith, sayings and traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. She uses these texts to illustrate that both moderate and extremist Muslims can find scriptural support for their positions, which is central to her crisis of faith and her eventual conclusions. Key texts referenced by Iman Atta. 1. Quranic verses. Meccan verses, peaceful, tolerant message. Verses that speak of no compulsion in religion and tolerance for Jews and Christians as people of the book. These are cited by moderates to support a peaceful, pluralistic Islam. Medinan verses, violent, intolerant message. Verses commanding jihad, violence against non-believers, and the subjugation of women and apostates. For example, then when the sacred months have passed, kill the idolaters wherever you find them. Surah At-Tawbah 9, verse 5, known as the verse of the sword, which abrogates earlier peaceful verses. Fight those who do not believe in God or the last day. Surah At-Tawbah 9, verse 29. O you who have believed, do not take the Jews and Christians as allies. Surah Al-Ma'idah 5, verse 51. Men are the maintainers of women, and beat them. Surah An-Nisa 4, verse 34. 2. Hadith prophetic traditions. I have been commanded to fight all people until they testify that there is no God but Allah and that Muhammad is the messenger of God. Sahih al-Bukhari, Volume 1, Book 2, Hadith number 24. Paradise is under the shadows of swords. Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. Whoever changes his religion, kill him. On apostasy. Hadiths justifying polygamy, child marriage, female genital mutilation, and the beating of wives and daughters. 3. Interpretation and abrogation. Iman specifically notes that the verse of the sword, Surah At-Tawbah 9, verse 5, abrogates 124 earlier verses that were peaceful, meaning that the later, more violent commands take precedence in classical Islamic jurisprudence. 4. Her conclusion. Iman's reflection is that both moderates and terrorists can cite authentic verses and hadiths to justify their actions. The moderates focus on the Meccan message, while the terrorists focus on the Medinan message. Both are true to the texts, which is why she finds the questions so troubling and ultimately unanswerable within the tradition itself. In summary, Iman Atta references both peaceful and violent Quranic verses and hadiths, highlighting the internal contradictions within the Islamic tradition. She points to the doctrine of abrogation and the duality of the Meccan and Medinan messages to show that both moderates and extremists have scriptural legitimacy for their views, which is central to her spiritual crisis and her eventual rejection of the faith as it is practiced in both forms. Iman Atta, Irshad, observes several striking differences between Muslim women in India and those in Afghanistan, based on her lived experience in both places. 1. Freedom of movement and dress. In India, Muslim women enjoy significantly more freedom of movement. They can walk in public, go to markets, and even attend mosques. Their dress is generally less restrictive. Many wear only a light, transparent headscarf, dupatta or hijab, and do not cover their faces or bodies with the full burqa or niqab. In Afghanistan, under the Taliban and in the Mujahideen camps, women are strictly confined to their homes or tents. They are required to wear the full burqa or niqab, covering themselves from head to toe, and are rarely allowed outside without a male guardian, mahram. Going out alone can result in severe punishment, including flogging. 2. Access to education and public life. In India, Muslim girls and women can attend school and participate in public life. Iman notices girls with backpacks heading to school and women working or socializing in public spaces. In Afghanistan, girls' schools are closed by the Taliban, and women are banned from education and public life. Their roles are limited to domestic duties, and they are denied opportunities for personal growth or independence. 3. Religious practice. In India, Muslim women are allowed to pray in mosques, albeit in separate sections from men. Iman is surprised to see this, as it is forbidden in Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia, where women are expected to pray at home. In Afghanistan, women are not allowed to enter mosques at all. Religious gatherings for women are limited to private homes and, even then, are tightly controlled and focused on enforcing obedience and submission. 4. Legal and social restrictions. In India, the legal system is secular and women have more rights and protections under the law. While there are still challenges, the environment is less oppressive than in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, Sharia law is strictly enforced, with corporal punishment for perceived transgressions. Women have few legal rights and are subject to the authority of male relatives and religious leaders. 5. Cultural attitudes. In India, there is a greater degree of integration with non-Muslim society, and Muslim women are influenced by broader Indian cultural norms, which are more permissive regarding women's roles and visibility. In Afghanistan, the culture is insular and deeply patriarchal, with strict gender segregation and a pervasive belief in women's inferiority and need for control. Iman's reflections. Iman concludes that the Muslim women in India are not as strictly observant of the Quranic and Hadith-based restrictions as those in Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia. She notes that the Taliban and Saudi women are, in fact, more true to the literal teachings of Islam regarding women's roles, while Indian Muslim women have adapted to a more open, pluralistic society. This realization leads her to reflect on the diversity within the Muslim world and the impact of local culture and law on women's lives. Indian laws provide a unique and evolving framework of protection for Muslim women, balancing religious personal law with constitutional guarantees of equality and justice. Here's a summary of how Indian laws protect Muslim women, based on recent legal reforms, landmark judgments, and constitutional provisions. 1. Constitutional protections. Equality and non-discrimination. The Indian Constitution guarantees equality before the law. Article 14 prohibits discrimination on grounds of religion, race, caste, sex, or place of birth. Article 15. And ensures the right to life and personal liberty. Article 21. These rights apply to all women, including Muslim women, and serve as a foundation for challenging discriminatory practices. 2. Key statutes and legal reforms. A. The Muslim Women Protection of Rights on Marriage Act, 2019. Criminalizes instant triple talaq. The act makes the practice of instant triple talaq, talaq-e-bid'at, a criminal offense, punishable by up to 3 years in prison. This was a major step following the Supreme Court's 2017 Sharia Banu judgment, which declared instant triple talaq unconstitutional. Right to maintenance. Women divorced by triple talaq are entitled to maintenance from their husbands. Custody of minor children. The act gives mothers the right to seek custody of minor children with a magistrate's approval. Bail and legal process. The law is cognizable and non-bailable, but the wife's side must be heard before bail is granted. The wife can also choose to forgive the husband, making the offense compoundable. B. The Muslim Women Protection of Rights on Divorce Act, 1986. Right to maintenance. A divorced Muslim woman is entitled to a reasonable and fair provision and maintenance during the iddat period, waiting period after divorce. Judicial interpretation. Danielle Latify v. Union of India has extended this right beyond the iddat period, potentially for life. Mahr and property. Women are entitled to receive their mahr, dowry, and any property given during or after marriage. Legal recourse. If the husband fails to pay, the woman can approach a magistrate, who can order payment and even issue warrants for noncompliance. Maintenance from relatives or Waqf board. If the woman cannot sustain herself and has no relatives able to support her, the state Waqf board can be directed to provide maintenance. C. The Dissolution of Muslim Marriages Act, 1939. Grounds for divorce. Muslim women can seek divorce on grounds such as cruelty, desertion, non-support, impotence, or failure to perform marital obligations. This act gives women the right to judicial divorce, fash. 3. Rights in marriage and divorce. Right to mahr, dowry. Every Muslim wife is entitled to a dowry, mahr, from her husband, which is her exclusive property. Right to seek divorce. Women can initiate divorce through khula, wife's offer, mubarat, mutual consent, or judicial intervention, fash. Protection from arbitrary divorce. The Supreme Court has ruled that a valid talaq must be pronounced for a reasonable cause, and, with an attempt at reconciliation, Shamim Era v. State of UP, 2002. 4. Maintenance and inheritance. Maintenance for children. Divorced women can claim maintenance for their children from the husband, and, if not possible, from relatives or the Waqf board. Inheritance rights. Muslim women have specific shares in inheritance under Muslim personal law, though these are often less than those of male heirs. Indian courts have sometimes intervened to ensure fair treatment. 5. Landmark judgments. Shah Banu case, 1985. The Supreme Court ruled that a divorced Muslim woman is entitled to maintenance under Section 125 of the Criminal Procedure Code, which applies to all citizens regardless of religion. This led to the 1986 Act, but subsequent judgments, Danielle Latify v. Union of India, ensured that maintenance must be reasonable and fair, and not limited to the iddat period. Shehra Banu v. Union of India, 2017. The Supreme Court declared instant triple talaq unconstitutional, paving the way for the 2019 Act. 6. Additional protections. Right to education and employment. The Constitution and various government schemes promote education and economic empowerment for Muslim women. Protection from domestic violence. Muslim women are also protected under the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act, 2005, which applies to all women in India. 7. Ongoing challenges. Despite these legal protections, challenges remain. Patriarchal interpretations. Many rights exist on paper but are not always enforced due to patriarchal norms and lack of awareness. Lack of codification. Muslim personal law in India is largely uncodified, leading to inconsistencies and difficulties in accessing justice. Social pressure. Cultural and community pressures often discourage women from seeking legal remedies. Summary table. Key legal protections for Muslim women in India. Area. Legal protection/remedy. Marriage. Right to mahr, right to seek divorce, khula, mubarat, fash, protection from polygamy. Divorce. Maintenance, beyond iddat, right to property, criminalization of instant triple talaq. Maintenance. Husband, relatives, or Waqf board responsible, court enforced. Custody. Right to seek custody of minor children. Inheritance. Specific shares under personal law, some judicial intervention for fairness. Domestic violence. Protection under general Indian law. Education/employment. Constitutional and government support. In summary, Indian law provides Muslim women with a range of protections, some rooted in personal law, others in constitutional and statutory law. Recent reforms, especially the criminalization of instant triple talaq and expanded rights to maintenance and divorce, have strengthened these protections. However, enforcement and social realities still present significant challenges, and ongoing legal and social reform is needed to ensure true equality and justice. According to Iman Atta, the protagonist, also known as Susan/Irshad, Afghan women are the ones who are truly following the teachings of Islam for women, not Indian Muslim women. Here's how the novel presents her reasoning. Iman observes that Muslim women in India enjoy more freedom of movement and dress than those in Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia. In India, Muslim women often only cover their heads with a light veil and can go to mosques, whereas in Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia, women are required to cover themselves completely, with abaya, niqab, or burqa, are rarely allowed out of their homes, and face severe restrictions on their movement and participation in public life. Iman explicitly concludes that Afghan and Saudi women are the true Muslims because they strictly obey the teachings of the Quran and the hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad regarding women's dress, seclusion, and roles. She contrasts this with Indian and Western Muslim women, who she believes do not practice these teachings as rigorously and have adopted more liberal customs influenced by their local cultures. She cites Quranic verses and hadiths that command women to stay in their homes and cover themselves completely, and notes that in Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia, these rules are enforced, while in India and the West, they are often not. Summary table. Country/context. Iman's view on Islamic practice for women. Afghanistan/Saudi Arabia. True to Quran and Hadith, strict dress, seclusion, obedience. India/West. Influenced by local culture, less strict, not true Islam. Key quote from the novel. This led her to conclude that Saudi women and the Taliban's harems are true Muslims, while Muslim women in India and Western countries do not practice the teachings of the Quran and the hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad. In summary, Iman Atta believes that Afghan women and Saudi women are the ones truly following the teachings of Islam for women, according to the correct interpretations of the Quran and hadiths, while Indian Muslim women are seen as more liberal and less adherent to these traditional rules. The novel cites several Quranic verses specifically related to women, their roles, rights, and restrictions. These verses are used in the narrative to illustrate the religious justifications for practices such as veiling, seclusion, obedience, polygamy, child marriage, wife-beating, FGM, and more. Below is a list of the main Quranic verses cited in the novel, along with the context in which they are referenced. 1. Veiling and modesty. O Prophet, tell your wives, daughters, and believing women to put on their outer garments, abaya/veil, so that they may be recognized and not harassed.
Surah Al-Ahzab 33, verse 59.
Used to justify the requirement for women to cover themselves completely in public.
Surah Al-Ahzab 33, verse 33.
And stay in your houses, and do not display yourselves like that of the times of ignorance. Cited to support the idea that women should remain at home and not be seen in public. 2. Obedience and authority. Surah An-Nisa 4, verse 34. Men are the maintainers of women because God has made some of them superior to others and because they spend of their wealth. As for those from whom you fear disobedience, admonish them, leave them in the beds, and beat them. Used to justify male authority, wife-beating, and the subordination of women. 3. Polygamy. Surah An-Nisa 4, verse 3. Marry as many women as are pleasing to you, 2, 3, or 4. But if you fear you will not be just, then 1. Cited to justify polygamy and the right of a man to have up to 4 wives. 4. Child marriage. Surah At-Talaq 65, verse 4. And those who no longer expect menstruation among your women, if you doubt, then their waiting period is 3 months, and also 4, those who have not menstruated yet. This verse is permitting marriage and divorce of prepubescent girls. 5. Testimony and inheritance.
Surah Al-Baqarah 2, verse 282.
And bring to witness 2 witnesses from among your men. And if there are not 2 men available, then a man and 2 women from those whom you accept as witnesses. Used to show that a woman's testimony is worth half that of a man, referenced in the context of legal proceedings. Surah An-Nisa 4, verse 11. Allah commands you regarding your children, for the male, what is equal to the share of 2 females. Cited regarding inheritance laws. 6. Travel restrictions. Hadith, not Quran, but cited alongside. A woman should not travel except with a mahram, male guardian. Used to justify restrictions on women's movement. 7. Other verses and hadiths.
Surah Al-Baqarah 2, verse 223.
Your women are a tilth for you, so go to your tilth as you wish. referenced in the context of marital relations and sexual rights. 8. Summary table of key verses cited. Topic: Quranic verses. Context in novel. Veiling/modesty. Al-Ahzab 33, verses 59, 33, verse 33. Dress code, seclusion, public behavior. Obedience/wife beating. An-Nisa 4, verse 34. Male authority, discipline, domestic violence. Polygamy. An-Nisa 4, verse 3. Multiple wives, marital rights. Child marriage. At-Talaq 65, verse 4. Marriage/divorce of prepubescent girls. Testimonies/inheritance.
Al-Baqarah 2, Derse 282, An-Nisa 4, Derse 11.
Legal status, inheritance shares. Travel restriction. Hadith, not Quran. Need for male guardian to travel. Marital relations.
Al-Baqarah 2, Derse 223.
Sexual rights in marriage. Many hadiths are cited throughout the novel. The author uses them to illustrate how religious texts are invoked to justify or enforce various practices affecting women, including dress codes, obedience, polygamy, child marriage, female genital mutilation, wife beating, sexual rights, and more. Below are some of the key hadiths cited in the book, along with the context in which they appear. 1. Veiling, modesty, and gender segregation. A woman who applies perfume to herself and passes in a group of men is an adulteress.
Sunan Abu Dawud, Sunan Al-Tirmidhi, Al-Nasai, Ibn Huzaimah, Ibn Hibban.
Used to justify prohibiting women from wearing perfume in public. May God curse the man who wore women's clothing and the woman who wore men's clothing. Cited to prohibit women from wearing pants or men's clothing. When women pledge allegiance to him, I do not shake hands with women.
Sunan Ibn Malik, Al-Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah.
Used to justify prohibiting women from shaking hands with men. Aisha said, "By God, the hand of the messenger of God did not touch another woman, other than his wives, who used to take her vows verbally only."
Sahih Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim.
Used to reinforce gender segregation. Beware of this world and beware of women. The first ordeal that afflicted the tribes of the children of Israel was about women. Sahih Muslim. Used to warn men about the dangers of women. I have not left behind a fitna or calamity more harmful to men than to women. Sahih Muslim. Used to justify restrictions on women. Beware of entering upon women, foreign women. They said, "O Messenger of God, what do you say about in-laws?" He said, "In-laws are as dangerous as death."
Sahih Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim.
Used to justify restrictions on male relatives visiting women. 2. Travel restrictions. A woman should not travel except with a mahram.
Sahih Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim.
Used to justify the rule that women cannot travel without a male guardian. 3. Sexual rights and marital relations. If a man invites his wife to satisfy his desire in bed, she should come to him while she is busy in the oven. Mishkat al-Masabi 1 Hadith number 61. Used to justify the husband's right to sex on demand. If a man invites his wife to his bed and she refuses, then he spends the night in anger. The angels will curse her until she gets up at dawn. Sahih al-Bukhari, Volume 7. Hadith number 121. Used to reinforce the obligation of sexual availability. Who has the soul of Muhammad in his hand? A woman cannot fulfill her duty to God until she fulfills her duty to her husband. If he asks her about intimacy, even if she is on a camel saddle, she should not refuse. Sunan Ibn Majah, Book 9, Hadith number 1926. Used to justify marital rape. If I had commanded someone to prostrate themselves in front of someone, I would have ordered women to prostrate to their husbands for the sake of men's rights over women.
Mishkat Al-Masabi, Hadis number 70. Abu Dawud, Ahmad, Al-Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, Ibn Hibban.
Used to emphasize the husband's authority. 4. Female genital mutilation, FGM. Circumcision is a sunnah for men and a preservation of honor for women. Sunan Abu Dawud. Used to justify FGM. Amatiyya al-Ansariya told that a woman used to circumcise girls in Medina, and the Prophet said to her, "Do not be negligent in that, because this makes the woman the best, and she is the most acceptance of the husband."
Sahih Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Tahara 49, Shaltut, Haitan Al-Anta, Liwa Al-Islam, 1951, page 55.
Used to support the practice of FGM. Aisha narrated, "If a man sits between her four branches, the arms and legs of his wife, and circumcision touches circumcision, they must perform ghusl or purify the body." Sahih Muslim, hadith number 349. Used to show that both men and women were circumcised. 5. Child marriage. The messenger wrote the marriage contract with Aisha when she was 6 years old, and he consummated the marriage with her when she was 9 years old, and she stayed with him for 9 years. Sahih al-Bukhari, Book 62, hadith number 89. Used to justify child marriage. 6. Polygamy. No direct hadith, but the practice is justified by reference to the Prophet's own polygamy and Quranic verses. 7. Wife beating and authority. The religious justification for the husband's right to beat his disobedient or rebellious wife is mentioned in the Quran as clearly as the sun, Surah An-Nisa 4, verse 34, but also supported by hadiths. The Prophet is cited as saying, "A man should not be asked why he beats his household." Sunan Ibn Majah Volume 3 Book 9 Hadith number 1986, Sunan Abu Dawud, Book 11, Hadith number 2142. The Prophet Muhammad said to the women, "I have not seen anyone weaker than you in intelligence and religion." Sahih al-Bukhari. Used to justify the claim that women are deficient in intellect and religion. 8. Testimony and inheritance. Isn't the testimony of 2 women equivalent to the testimony of 1 man? This is a deficiency in your intelligence. Sahih al-Bukhari. Used to explain why a woman's testimony is worth half a man's. 9. Other notable hadiths. The Prophet Muhammad asked his daughter Fatima, "What does God require of a woman?" She said, "She does not see a man, and the man does not see her." The Prophet embraced his daughter and said, "Blessed offspring from blessed offspring." Used to reinforce seclusion and modesty. The dog, the donkey, and the woman invalidate a man's prayer whenever they pass in front of him, cutting off between the worshipper and the Qibla. Used to show the perceived impurity of women in ritual contexts. What is the author's stance on these hadiths? The author of the novel takes a highly critical and polemical stance toward the hadiths, especially those used to justify the oppression, abuse, and subjugation of women. Throughout the novel, hadiths are not presented as neutral religious texts, but as instruments that, in the author's view, have been weaponized to enforce patriarchal control, justify violence, and perpetuate misogyny. Here's a breakdown of the author's stance, as evidenced by the text. 1. Hadiths as tools of oppression. The novel repeatedly shows male characters, husbands, mullahs, judges, invoking hadiths to justify beating wives and daughters, enforcing strict dress codes and seclusion, demanding sexual availability from wives, practicing polygamy and child marriage, supporting female genital mutilation (FGM). The author explicitly critiques this use, portraying it as a means to silence women and legitimize abuse. 2. Questioning authenticity and morality. The protagonist, Irshad/Susan, at several points questions the authenticity and morality of hadiths, especially those that condone FGM, wife beating, and child marriage. When she voices doubts about the hadiths that justify FGM, her husband reacts with violence, and the narrative frames her skepticism as both reasonable and courageous. The author uses these moments to highlight the dangers of blind obedience to religious texts and the suppression of critical thinking, especially for women. 3. Hadiths versus human rights. The novel draws a sharp contrast between the values promoted by these hadiths and universal human rights, particularly women's rights. The author's commentary and the protagonist's journey suggest that many hadiths are fundamentally incompatible with modern standards of justice, equality, and dignity for women. 4. Hadiths as a source of trauma. The narrative repeatedly links the invocation of hadiths to the protagonist's trauma and suffering, as well as to the suffering of other women and girls in the story. The author's tone is often one of outrage, sorrow, and a call to action against the continued use of these texts to justify abuse. 5. Explicit critique and call for reform. In the latter part of the novel, the protagonist becomes an outspoken critic of the hadiths and the systems that enforce them, using her story to advocate for women's rights and to expose what the author sees as the dangers of religious fundamentalism. The author's stance is not just critical, but calls for open discussion, reform, and the rejection of any religious teaching, hadith or otherwise, that enables harm. 6. Representative quotes. She has always convinced herself that the unbeatable problem is not in the Quran and the hadiths of the Prophet, but rather in the interpretations of those divine texts. The Australian wife believes that if these sacred texts are subject to better reading and understanding, then the Islamic society will be a perfect society, but this belief is later challenged by her experiences. Her blind belief was shaken one day when she got into a serious quarrel with her Saudi husband. The fight occurred one evening after the foreign family had returned from a celebration of female genital mutilation. When she got home, she talked to her Saudi husband about it and expressed her doubts about the authenticity of those hadiths that justified such a vicious practice. When Mustafa confronted her, as usual, with 2 hadiths, the Australian wife commented with the words of doubt that turned her Saudi husband into a voracious animal. Summary table. Author's stance on hadiths. Aspect. Author's stance. Use of hadiths. Criticizes their use to justify abuse, control, and misogyny. Authenticity. Questions the morality of many hadiths. Human rights. Views many hadiths as incompatible with women's rights and dignity. Reform. Advocates for critical examination, reform, and rejection of harmful teachings. Narrative tone. Outspoken, polemical, and activist. In summary, the author's stance is clear. The hadiths, as cited and used in the novel, are depicted as central to the perpetuation of women's oppression in many Islamic societies. The novel is a call to question, challenge, and reform the use of these texts and to prioritize human rights and dignity over blind adherence to tradition. What is the author's stance on these hadiths? The author, Dr. A. Ahmed, takes a highly critical and polemical stance toward these hadiths. The novel argues that the cited hadiths are not only authentic, but are actively used to justify and perpetuate abuse, violence, and oppression against women. The author rejects apologetic interpretations that claim such practices are misinterpretations or cultural distortions. Instead, he asserts that the problem lies in the core texts themselves, not just their interpretation. The narrative repeatedly emphasizes that these hadiths are authentic, found in Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, etc., and are therefore binding in traditional Islamic law. The author's stance is that these hadiths are the root cause of systemic misogyny, violence, and the suffering of women in the societies depicted. He calls for exposing and rejecting these teachings, and for supporting women who resist or escape them. How do readers react to this stance? The novel itself describes a polarized reaction among readers and audiences. Muslim readers and communities, especially in the West, are depicted as being outraged, accusing the author and protagonist of lying, fabricating hadiths, or misrepresenting Islam. The book describes protests, legal complaints, and even threats of violence against the protagonist for her public speeches and writings. Supporters of women's rights, ex-Muslims, and some secular or Christian readers are shown as supportive, praising the protagonist's courage in exposing abuse and advocating for change. The book describes the protagonist as being invited to speak at universities, churches, and public events, and as founding associations for abused Muslim women. The novel also describes media controversy and legal battles, with some institutions banning the protagonist's speeches as hate speech, while others defend her right to free expression. In summary, the author's stance is intentionally provocative and designed to spark debate, with reactions ranging from admiration and gratitude to anger, protest, and even kidnap and violence against the protagonist Susan, former Irshad. Final days of Aman Atta and her children in New Delhi. In their last days in India, waiting for resettlement, Irshad, as Aman Atta, and her children wait for a decision from the UN and embassies. Living in uncertainty, they live in a small apartment, relying on UN aid, and fear being sent back to Afghanistan or Pakistan. Hope and anxiety. Irshad is anxious about the future but hopeful for a new life in the West. Preparation. She prepares her children for possible resettlement, teaching them English and basic skills. Relief. Eventually, they are accepted for resettlement in Canada, marking the end of their ordeal in Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, and India and the beginning of a new chapter.